And so we move on now to episode 4 of season 3 of Star Trek Picard, No-Win Scenario. Massive spoilers ahead, so please pause the video now. If you haven't seen the episode, go watch it and then come back to me. Okay, last week's biggest criticisms of episode 3 were probably based around the ending, when Riker dramatically kicked Picard off the bridge of the Titan after he followed the Admiral's advice to attack the Shrike. This was arguably not the best strategy, but regardless, the question was, would Riker really speak this way to his old commanding officer? Did the circumstances warrant this kind of reaction? And of course, Riker has only himself to blame. He didn't have to accept Picard's advice. As the captain of the Titan in that moment, the responsibility for command decisions taken rests with the captain. It rests with Riker, not the person in his ear. As for telling Picard, you just killed us all, and then telling him to remove himself from the bridge, firstly, you don't speak that way in front of your subordinates on the bridge of a ship. It scares the hell out of them, and it's unprofessional. It doesn't instill confidence, and it can have a devastating effect on morale. Riker should have taken Picard aside and said what he wanted to say in private in the conference room. Anyway, the biggest complaint likely going to be directed at this 4th episode is the very regrettable F-bomb, made worse by the fact that it's dropped by Picard. This happens in a scene in the holodeck bar with Jack Crusher. This particular profanity wasn't scripted and was an improv by Patrick Stewart. But regardless, the final cut of the episode should have removed this. I can't imagine there's going to be too many fans thrilled with Picard dropping an F-bomb. It makes me wince every time I hear it, and it remains another unfortunate blemish on an otherwise very good season. But F-bombs are an unnecessary holdover from New Trek. Putting that aside, episode 4 is the strongest episode of the season thus far, though I would argue episodes 5 and 6 are stronger still. In fact, I think 4, 5, and 6 are some of the best episodes of Trek in a very long time. The conflict between Picard and Riker is thankfully resolved fairly quickly in this episode. Riker's conservative run-and-hide tactic of dealing with the Shrike was based upon his fear of loss and desire to protect the crew of the Titan at any cost, given the death of his own son. Whereas Picard had just gained a son, who he learned initially rejected him, because he didn't want to seek him out when he became an adult. Picard was ultimately ready to fight to defend what he'd just gained. With the Titan dead in the water, and now being hit by occasional bioelectric pulses from the nebula, things are not looking good. Riker goes to Picard's quarters to explain the situation and to apologize, but to also admit that Picard had been right, and Riker was running from something. The same darkness he saw in the 6-foot hole of his son's grave is now upon him once again, as he must grapple with his own fears and mortality. This is yet another powerful emotional character-driven scene, and Jonathan Frakes does the best acting I've ever seen him do. Frakes also directed this episode. He explains to Picard that despite travelling to the far reaches of space together, there has never been anything that has proven to him that there is anything after this life. In many respects, Riker is going through a kind of spiritual experience, and I don't mean that in a religious or theological sense, but in its most literal form. I kind of wish more was made out of this in his story arc for this season, because it would be truly something unique and profound for Star Trek to explore. It is kind of touched upon ever so slightly later in the season, but not to any serious degree. This is a very welcome and honest character development in my view. However, what frustrates me about Star Trek is the rather narrow perspective it often takes on such philosophical questions. Because of the scientific and secular nature of the franchise, it often takes a rather smug view of concepts like spirituality, faith, God, and an afterlife. I'm specifically not focusing on religion here because I don't want to be divisive or turn anyone off, but the audience of Star Trek is made up of people who believe in all sorts of things. There's people who are atheists, agnostic, religious, or just spiritual, for example. And we have seen examples of alien species having their own religions. The Bajorans believe the wormhole aliens are gods, and they call them the prophets, but the Federation believe they are literally just wormhole aliens. The Bajorans have built an entire church, for lack of a better word, around the prophets. On the other hand, the Klingons are spiritual without being religious. They see Kahless as a spiritual leader, and they believe in an afterlife called Stovokor, which is their heaven, and Greythor, which is their hell. It seems all too often on Star Trek, spirituality, faith, and the belief in transcendent states of being beyond the tangible and material are reserved only for the alien species and not for the human beings. I'm not trying to proselytize to anyone here. I simply feel that human beings are more than just soulless evolved animals that live and die and cease to exist. And it would be entirely organic and believable if there were a character on the show who, having faced the loss of their child and their own mortality, had reached a spiritual awakening as to the greater possibilities beyond this universe and this life. It doesn't have to be some heavy-handed, preachy message either. Even some subtle overture in that direction would be at least interesting. He does say that he tried to shake the feeling that there's nothing after this life, suggesting that he wants to believe in something more. Ultimately, it's entirely understandable that a grieving parent would want to believe that they would see their dead child once again. Whether you believe in an afterlife or not, I think you can at least sympathize with that sentiment. All too often, Star Trek tries to keep things rooted only in the realm of the material and scientifically observable, but that doesn't address a deeper human question and desire to understand: is this all there is? Is there something more? Regardless, the scene is beautifully written and acted. Riker goes on to talk about how Deanna couldn't live with Riker feeling nothing, because he feels empty, and so he left. He jumped at the chance to help Picard to get away from the numbness he was experiencing at home, which of course can be part of the grieving process as well. So here he is, trying to run from that emptiness, only to find it again. He tells Picard to take the next few hours to get to know his son and get his affairs in order. Next up, 7 of 9 goes to the quarters of the Changeling, who had been masquerading as a Starfleet officer. She finds the remains of the crewman. Riker tells her that the news that there's a changeling aboard needs to be kept quiet because morale is low enough as it is. She's taken aback by this at first, but he says that he can use her unofficial capacity to their advantage. She proceeds to work with the still recovering Shaw to try to track down the changeling. Shaw continues to deliver the best lines and driest cynical wit on the show. She asks him if they can talk. He says, officially, no. She asks unofficially. He responds, no. His deadpan misanthropic nature is just hilarious at times. Picard takes Jack to the 10-forward bar simulation. There's a line in there explaining why the holodeck still works despite the crippled condition of the ship, which I think Star Trek has needed an explanation for a long time. Picard explains that the holodeck uses a small independent power supply so that the holodeck can serve as a kind of sanctuary in times of distress. I thought that worked quite well, actually. They finally have a proper get-to-know-you chat while 7 of 9 and Shaw work together to try to figure out what the Changeling was doing and, of course, how to find him. They wonder why the Changeling chose to take the appearance of a transporter technician. Maybe that might be important for later in the season. Shaw helps 7 devise a means of tracking down the Changeling by first finding his bucket that he needs to regenerate in, and then telling the computer to scan for the residue left behind inside it. There's a nice Easter egg on the pad that she uses, a photo of Odo, another nod to the late René Auberjonois. On the Shrike, Vadic uses a very unusual communication device to speak to her superior. She activates this by cutting her hand off, because we now know she's a changeling, and then it falls into the bowl and turns into a disembodied floating goo head. A very strange decision to go with this, actually. I have quite a few things to say about what's actually going on here, but I can't say anything until the final episode airs, because to do so would just give way too much away. She explains very fearfully to the CGI head that the Titan got away and cannot escape the center of the gravity well. The CGI head demands that she pursue. She says she can't because the Daystrom portal tech that they have on board utilizes gravimetric distortions. The head repeats, pursue. She then agrees. They jettison the portal tech. I feel this decision was taken largely because they couldn't keep using the portal tech in the story. It's just too powerful a weapon, and at some point the Titan is going to have to get the upper hand, so the Shrike has to be compromised somehow. We get another flashback of Picard in the Real 10 Forward bar from 5 years ago. He's about to have lunch, but he's interrupted by several young cadets who want him to regale them with his heroics from his career. This all pays off later on. Back in the holodeck, present day, Jack explains to Picard that he's used to being alone and that he wants to reassure his father that this heart-to-heart is not a moment that he really needs per se, but Picard explains, with an emotional vulnerability, that it is something he needs. Meantime, Seven tracks down the changeling, but he gets away. Picard proceeds to tell Jack a story involving his namesake, the older Jack Crusher, Beverly's former husband, and that's where the F-bomb is dropped. Oh well. Shaw arrives in the holodeck, pulls up a chair at the bar, and proceeds to crap all over this heartfelt moment by explaining that he fought the Borg at Wolf 359 when he was a younger officer, and it appears he was quite traumatized by being selected to go in an escape pod by his superior officer. He wonders what he'd done to deserve the chance to survive, given that he was, in his words, just some dipshit from Chicago. He tells Jack that Picard was on the Borg cube, setting the world on fire. He mentions that Picard was the only Borg to be given a name, Locutus. The reference to setting the world on fire is a callback to the song that's played at the beginning of the first episode, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots. Suffice to say, this conversation is ultimately meaningful in more ways than one, and Todd Stashwick does a fantastic job, taking the scene to another level of intensity. Jack defends his father, but Picard decides to leave. Tensions have to be high at this point. The ship is dying. They don't have long left. Beverly explains that the nebula is basically a giant womb. They have to get out of that nebula before the whole thing gives birth. Jack suggests that somehow they can try absorbing the energy of the discharges to give the Titan a boost. There's a great conference room scene that harkens back to the TNG days. Long story short, they need Shaw's engineering expertise to help them channel the wave energy from the nacelles into the warp core. Picard and Seven go to see him in his quarters. What I really like about the writing here is that Picard doesn't go to him with any animosity or ill will or nursing any hurt feelings. He takes the high ground. All too often on modern Star Trek, there's been way too much emotional oversharing and hug-it-out moments, or characters screaming and shouting at each other. In this situation, Picard and Shaw settle their differences like men. Shaw respects people who stand up to him, and Picard just playfully barbs, I need your help, despite the fact that you are indeed a dipshit from Chicago. To which Shaw, who's taken aback, replies, nice. And that's all that's needed. The tension between them is broken. They just get on with it and they start working together. Seven helps Shaw in the nacelle control room, but they're intercepted by a changeling pretending to be the young LaForge. Seven realizes this when the changeling refers to her as Commander Hansen and not Commander Seven. They successfully get out of the nebula, despite a last-minute appearance from the Shrike. It's a great action scene, and the entire cast really shine here. There's a fantastic feel-good factor about the final few moments of this episode as they navigate the minefield, with Picard using his experience and Jack helping him where he can. Riker gives the Shrike a taste of its own medicine, grabbing an asteroid with the Titan's tractor beam and flinging it at the Shrike as they fly past. The Shrike is badly damaged, but it's not destroyed, unfortunately. The nebula disappears and millions of floating alien life forms fly around in a very awe-inspiring moment that's kind of reminiscent of the ending of Encounter at Farpoint when the aliens are finally released into space, complete with a beautiful musical score. Beverly's line about seeking out new life reminds us that this show is ultimately supposed to be about exploring space. We flash back and forth between 5 years ago in the bar and present day on the Titan Bridge as Picard realizes he has indeed met Jack before. 5 years ago he had been in the bar with those other cadets, and without revealing his identity, he had asked Picard if he ever had a family, but Picard says that Starfleet was the only family he ever needed. And young Jack is absolutely devastated by this reply. I thought this was another fantastic unspoken heart-rending scene, and I honestly didn't see it coming. Jack and Picard are both thinking the same thing at the same time and saying nothing to each other, while Jack struggles to hide his pain. What makes this more profound and poignant is the fact that in the previous episode, Picard had thought he'd been outright rejected by Jack, and that Jack hadn't made any attempt to get to know his father. But the truth is, Jack had indeed tried to reach out to him several years ago and was badly hurt in the process. Later, Riker speaks to Deanna in a very heartfelt resolution scene between them. And what's so poignant about the end of this, what's so profound about it, is that Riker in the beginning was so convinced that he was staring into the abyss of death. And yet, in the end of the episode, he and the rest of the crew witnessed the birth of new life. In many respects, this conclusion is somewhat reminiscent of the end of Star Trek II, when Kirk feels young after witnessing the creation of the Genesis planet. Picard delivers his first captain's log since Star Trek Nemesis, and the episode finally ends with Jack having another one of those hallucinations about the black tentacle branch things and the red door. Some people were sold on this season after the first episode. Some people warmed to it after episode 2. And for other people, it took till the third episode before they were won over. I'd imagine a lot more people will be bought into this season after episode 4. The season isn't going to please everyone, however, but I think most people can acknowledge that after 4 episodes, it's clear that the plot is remaining cohesive and on course. So season 3 is a very different animal to seasons 1 and 2. I think, flaws aside, this was a dynamite episode of Star Trek, but my favourite one of the season is up next. Let me know your thoughts on this one, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.